This video will briefly go over the main parts of the cerebral cortex and their functions. But first, just a couple notes on terminology about how to look at and navigate through the brain. We'll take an example of a dog first. So the rostral area is towards the head of the dog, and the caudal area is towards the back of the dog. For these, I think of rostral like nostril, so rostral, nostril, like towards the front. For caudal, I think tail, so tail of the dog. Then we have ventral, the bottom, and dorsal, the top. I don't have a great way of remembering this, but I think of dorsal like dome, so the top of your dome is dorsal, and ventral, I think of vents like floor vents, which are at the bottom. But for humans, these terms seem a little different than animals. But you kind of have to imagine the dog standing up on its hind legs and bending its head down forward to mimic a human. So now the ventral side is the front side of the body and the dorsal side is the back. But for the brain, we'll need to remember that ventral means the bottom of the brain and dorsal still means the top of the brain. Rostral means the front or anterior part of the brain, and caudal here means the back or posterior part of the brain. In neuroscience, we look at a lot of brain scans, and there are a few different ways you can cut the brain to look at them. The first one is a sagittal cut. For this, imagine you're trying to split the head down the middle when someone is looking directly at you. So this would split into the two hemispheres of the brain. Next, we have a coronal slice. For this, imagine you're looking at the side of the brain and then cut down the middle from there. So this would split the brain into the front and back sections. And the last one we'll talk about here is a horizontal slice. We'll stick with the side view again, and then we're going to slice sideways. So this would split the brain into top and bottom halves. And actually, so the last one I'll talk about is medial versus lateral. So here, imagine again, someone is facing forwards or towards you. When we talk about medial parts of the brain, this means areas closer to the middle of the brain. And then when we talk about lateral areas, we mean areas closer to the outer left and outer right side of the brain. So just keep all this in mind when visualizing and talking about different regions of the brain. Okay, now on to divisions of the brain. Here is a nasty table that breaks up the major divisions of the brain. The names of some of these sound really similar, but it's something you'll just have to become familiar with. The brain is broken up into the hindbrain, midbrain, and forebrain. In the hindbrain, the two major divisions are the myencephalon and metencephalon. The myencephalon contains the medulla, and the metencephalon contains the cerebellum and the pons. The midbrain here is referred to as the mesencephalon, and there are no further divisions here. In the forebrain, we have the telencephalon and the diencephalon. The diencephalon is made up of the thalamus and the hypothalamus. The telencephalon is made up of the basal ganglia, the limbic system, and the rest of the cortex. So this table is for your reference when you're studying and relating these names to specific areas. The cerebellum is not part of the cortex, it's part of the metencephalon, but nevertheless, we'll still talk about it. So the cerebellum literally means little brain, and it's easy to see why. It's here at the bottom right of this diagram. This area is packed tightly with neurons and proportionately is home to most of the brain's neurons. It's tightly folded with many layers, kind of like an accordion. The cerebellum is really critical for maintaining posture, for walking, and for making coordinated movements. It doesn't directly control movements, it's more kind of indirectly related. It helps to integrate information about the body, such as the size of body parts, the speed in which it's moving, along with broader motor commands. So it tweaks or modifies motor outputs to perform coordinated and smooth movements. Without the cerebellum, every move we would make would be just incredibly jerky, and athletes wouldn't be able to perform their highly coordinated and fluid motions. I have a video in the supplemental section on Canvas that shows some of the struggles patients with ataxia can have. Lastly, the cerebellum is not all about movement. New research is coming out every year that implicates the cerebellum in different types of cognition, including learning, attention, and some aspects of language. The thalamus, which is in the diencephalon, is an egg-shaped structure practically in the center of the brain. There are two sides, a left and a right side. The thalamus has been referred to as the gateway to the cortex, or the sensory switchboard of the brain. And this is because, except for a few olfactory inputs, all sensory information is relayed through the thalamus before it continues to higher parts of the brain. There are several specific subunits of the thalamus, but the two major ones I want to talk about here are the lateral and medial geniculate nucleus. There's no good way to remember this, but the lateral geniculate nucleus primarily sends projections to the primary visual cortex, and the medial geniculate nucleus sends info to the primary auditory cortex. So lateral means vision, and medial means auditory. The hypothalamus, outlined here in yellow, sits right below the thalamus, which in this diagram is red. The hypothalamus provides the main link between the nervous system and the endocrine system, and it's the main site for hormone production and control. It controls functions necessary for homeostasis, or maintaining a normal state of the human body. So it regulates things like thirst, hunger, fatigue, internal body temperature. And it does this through control of the pituitary gland, which sits at the base of the hypothalamus. So the hypothalamus controls the pituitary gland, and the pituitary gland is responsible for releasing hormones into the bloodstream, where they can then move on to different internal organs and influence those tissues and organs.